What's up, interpreters? So my name's Sophie Daniels and I'm President of Interpretation Australia, and I'm also the Interpretation and Placemaking Manager at Royal Botanic Gardens, Sydney.
What's up, interpreters? My name's Scott Killeen. I'm the Vice President for Interpretation Australia, and when I'm not doing that, I'm a consultant with Kelp Creative.
What's up, interpreters? My name's John Pastorelli and I teach at TAFE as well as doing some consultancy work here and there, mostly focused around the natural environment. That's my go-to area. Love it.
What is up, interpreters? I am NAI's Executive Director, Paul Caputo. What a world we live in where we can be sitting here. It is Tuesday afternoon for me. It is Wednesday morning in Australia, and we're just sitting here chatting about interpretation. Thank you so much for being here, for making time first thing in the morning over your coffee while I'm enjoying my early evening in Colorado. Obviously, you all are integrally involved with Interpretation Australia. My life and livelihood is the National Association for Interpretation. So I want to start, and Sophie, I'll start with you on this question since you're the president of Interpretation Australia. What is the challenge? I think we face a similar challenge in reaching people who are doing interpretation, but they don't realize that they're doing interpretation. This is something that NAI struggles with. I'm curious how you all tackle that in Australia.
So I guess, Paul, it's about really doing a lot of connecting with different groups. So we have a really fantastic committee who head up Interpretation Australia, who come from diverse backgrounds and who work in diverse areas of interpretation, including things like guiding in natural environments, as John does, and I'm sure he'll chat more about that. And also from my area, which is Botanic Gardens, where we also have a lot of tours that go on for, say, cruise ships or other domestic and international tourist groups. And our education and visitor services department also think about interpretation in a different way, don't realize that it is interpretation that they are doing, and very powerful interpretation that they're doing. That beautiful face-to-face, person-to-person interpretation is such a wonderful way to make really indelible connections and share stories. So I guess also we need to reach out more to potentially our volunteers services across Australia as well, because we have a lot of volunteer guiding organisations too. So I think that's a big piece of work that we're yet to really complete, but we're definitely on our way to getting there.
Just following on from what Sophie was mentioning there, so I teach at TAFE, which is our vocational college, vocational education sector, and my role here would really be, apart from teaching, an advocate for what I'm calling an interpretive approach. So for me, how I focus in on that interpretive way of doing things, because I work across a whole range of different tourism-based industries, even though I've got an interest in the natural side of things, is really to put it forward in a very clear way. I need to be clear in my own mind what an interpretive approach is, what those principles are, and my suggestion to students, those people that participate in these courses, is that this is one approach, an interpretive approach, and it involves these practices, these principles, and these are the outcomes. Your choice. The thing is that if you choose, like Sophie said, if you choose to go down an interpretive approach, then it's a very powerful way of communicating. And we know that through research. We've known that for years through research. So, and that's part of the other element that I bring up. So it's more an experiential approach that I go down, because I've got the students, or I encourage the students to try different ways of presenting. And invariably, when we go down an interpretive approach, they're hooked. They love it. And then they become proponents and advocates for it as well.
And I think there's definitely a couple of challenges, which, you know, Paul, I'm sure you face the same, is that, as you said, there is a lot of people doing the work that don't know, they don't use the term, they don't know that they're doing it. And certainly the strategy that Interpretation Australia, or IA, as we call it, has at the moment, is really recognizing that broader and that breadth of people that are doing interpretation, whether they know it or not. And so perhaps in the past, it was a bit of a sense of saying, well, you really shouldn't do it unless you know what you're doing. But now it's about, I think, really embracing that there are lots of people who have the opportunity and the potential to do that. So how can we help really enhance their practice? So Interpretation Australia in the last strategy said, let's really embrace this idea of taking it and building that network, as Sophie was talking about. So really saying, rather than trying to, narrow it down and get the few people to do it really well, let's embrace the breadth of practice. So let's talk about archaeologists and architects and landscape architects and all those people who are doing that by their very nature. And then how do we build that network to really help them improve their practice? And the other challenge, which we're facing and always have been, I've been involved with IA for a good number of years now, before I had grey long hair. And it's that term, what is interpretation anyway? And so, for many years we've talked about, should we just forget it and talk about something else? And we've certainly recently toyed about the idea of, what about if we've subbed it out for something like, let's talk about visitor experiences, because that's essentially what we all create. So there's a little bit of always that tension around that term, what is interpretation? And I think understanding where it comes from really helps to understand it, and therefore the work that people do. But I think there's still the challenges that we face, but I think we're at the point where we're taking those head on and trying to build a network and people understanding what they do and then helping them improve what they do.
For me, it's always been a challenge, that definition thing. And I know with you and NAI, you've spent time and now you've got a new definition. And can I ask a question of you? Have you felt that that's helped that journey through re-articulating and redefining who you are?
I think the main thing with NAI's new definition for us, and John, I see what you're doing, turning the tables on me here, by the way. So don't think I don't see your tactics. NAI's new definition, I think what was most important about it in my mind was that it removed the places where interpretation happens and focused entirely on it's a communication process. It is, as you said, the research bears out that it is a kind of communication that creates results. And I think that the fact that interpretation creates experiences or contributes to experiences, and I'm trying to choose my words very carefully because this was this conversation, was a years long process, and, committees and academics and our 16-person board of directors. So,
Wow.
and I do have, I'm actually interested in this because I have NAI's definition up on my computer right now, which is that it is a purposeful approach to communication that facilitates meaningful, relevant, and inclusive experiences that deepen understanding, broaden perspectives, and inspire engagement with the world around us. And, the reason I have these up is because I was going to ask you all if you feel that there is a fundamental difference between interpretation in the US and interpretation in Australia. And I should point out that Scott and John and I have known each other for a decade and a half because of NAI's international conference and because of the importance that IA places on being involved as part of this global interpretation community. IA's definition, which taken from your website, interpretation communicates ideas, information, and knowledge about locations, the natural world, or historic places in a way which helps visitors to make sense of their environment. Good interpretation will create engaging, unique, and meaningful experiences for visitors. Those are pretty close to one another, right? Like, I wouldn't say that one of those is better or worse, or that they are fundamentally different conceptually. I'm curious to know from you all, though, since you are involved with interpretation on a global scale, but also interpretation in many ways by its definition is hyper local. Do you think there's a difference between interpretation in the US and Australia and perhaps other places, Europe and Asia and other places around the world?
My personal belief is I'm leaning a bit more towards what you read out as your definition, because I believe interpretation is experience-led. It's not the interpreter-led, it's not the visitor-led, it's not place-led, it's experience-led. And what I mean by that is that we as interpreters need to facilitate the overlaps between those. And then that experience component is what we manage. Now, whether we do that, obviously I'm thinking more from a face-to-face perspective because that's my world. And that's why I need to adjust, adapt. I might have a great commentary, and if place and or the visitor is not aligned to that, I need to adapt because it's experience-led.
I think that people are people, no matter where you are, right? So that's a huge question, but we're always after the same thing, which is, as John said, it's led by experience. And it's also about that creation of connections between people and place and ideas. And really the emotion is at the heart of it to create something real and lasting. it has to really hit people in the heart. So I feel like we are all after the same thing, no matter where we are on the planet, when we are trying to create good interpretation.
Yeah, that's just so important, Sophie. It is. That's at the heart of what we do. That emotive connection, like, because, and especially like in this tourism sector, because a lot of people think, oh, I need to know the facts, need to know the information. Yeah, that's part of it. And you know, facilitate emotions in that experience to provide those anchor memories, those movements, those emotive connections you're talking about that mean something for those people.
I think fundamentally, at the core, that's quite similar. As you know, Sophie and John talk about, we're after the same thing. So for me, it's not about the definition and the principles. I think they're quite similar and they're fundamentally the same. It's about the application and the scale and the context. So I think for us, the scale is quite a different level. So a much smaller community of interpreters. And as we said, I think there's a growing number of people that are doing that without knowing that they're doing it. And that scale means that the way that people come together and that agreed way that people approach it is quite different. So it's very hard to study interpretation formally in Australia at the moment. There are courses like John, there are small subjects within some university courses and some postgraduate or undergraduate courses, but very few. That's one of the challenges. Terminology, even though, as you know, John says, we don't spend lots of time with terminology, but in the last little while, there has been a shift, I think, within Australia, shift towards, particularly from a funded point of view, towards interpreting built heritage. And so particularly around the idea of saving and protecting heritage. So things like ICOMOS, and there's an Australian chapter of ICOMOS in the Borough Charter. Well, that's really helpful and really great to have that focus. But what's been really interesting, I think, is there's been a shift. There's more funding potentially for interpreting those sites as they're managed, whether they have to be removed for, you know, for building or being protected. And so the term even heritage interpretation has become synonymous with built heritage. And so there's this context and conversation now around, well, if heritage interpretation is about built heritage, well, what do we do about culture and what do we do about nature? And so, well, actually, it's natural and cultural heritage interpretation, and heritage is defined by all of those things that we all know. And so I think in the last probably 10 years, because of that shift, it's become a little confused. And that's where I think, again, a lot of people are doing this without understanding that they're doing interpretation, because it's becoming a bit more of a narrow focus and a narrow field. And that because of that practice of needing, you know, legislated, I need to interpret this, that often results in a very simple, almost didactic, you know, let's get a sign up there to talk about the history of the building, and then we can tick that box and we're done. And that does shift away from what we're talking about, that very experiential approach. So I think for me, I said the principles across both the states and here and sort of internationally, we've been involved in the Global Association of Heritage Interpretation as well. When we talk about that, the principles are already similar. I think it's the application and the context. And I think in the last few years, our context has become a little bit narrower, and we're at the point just trying to, you know, open those doors again and remind everybody that it is a broader, all-encompassing sort of practice that's across the natural and cultural heritage. And the definition of that, just from a purely understanding the context in which we work and trying to improve that practice again.
Well, Scott, you've led into what I think is a really important question for this group. NAI is one of 8 organizing partners, along with Interpretation Australia and 6 other organizations around the world, in the Global Association for Heritage Interpretation, GAHI, we call it. It's an informal group, but we do a lot of formal things. We've done a series of free webinars. We're going to have a World Cafe coming up in September. So we do a lot of important work on a global scale with interpretation. NAI and Interpretation Australia partnered on the 2010 International Conference that was up there in Townsville on the Gold Coast. So I'm curious to know, why is it important for Interpretation Australia, from your perspective, to be involved in interpretation on a global scale and not just locally to Australia?
I think that whenever more than one interpreter is in the room with another, sparks start flying around ideas and shared challenges and innovative approaches. And so the wider our beautiful, you know, connections and network that stretch all the way around the world, the more likely it is that we're all going to achieve amazing things together and be inspired by each other's incredible work. So I think that it's so important, you know, even just being in an organization, keeping your head down and working on what your projects are can be quite limiting. We need to look up and out and connect with each other so we can all be stronger together.
Paul, that you know, why it's important is exactly that idea that each of it, as interpreters, our practice, I think, is just enriched by learning from each other, and that breadth and scope that you can get from even just hearing about what somebody did and how they went about it. And that idea, you know, I talk about the challenges that we sometimes face, particularly around scale and that sort of narrowed focus, but that's only the reality that we've sort of landed in. It's not our real reality. You know, if we just sort of, you know, start to look a bit broader, I think there are thousands of people within Australia literally that are doing this sort of work that just don't quite know it yet. And I think in a few years, as we start to engage them, and so Sophie said, as you look up and look out, there's that sense, oh, I'm not doing this strange little thing all on my own. There's actually all these other people, not even locally within my state, but within Australia and more broadly globally. There's a real empowering sense of that you know, you're not alone and you're doing something that's, you know, real, that's recognized and that makes difference. And I think that's really, really empowering. And one of the things we're trying to do, and that the reason we love being involved in Gahi is for that reason, is really connecting people and reminding them that they do really important work and that they're not alone and that they can really leverage and learn from each other.
And I think it also, Paul, I think it speaks to a fundamental human need, and that is a need to belong. We need to belong to someone, somewhere, a community. And when we're doing what, to borrow from your definition about purposeful work, when we're in that meaning space, to belong in a community of other people within that meaning space, that's a pretty powerful space to be in, and a very rich space to be in as well, because it's in that emotive space that Sophie talks about. It's in that future emotive space, that meaningful space, that doing something in the greater good. And I think that sense of being part of, that Scotty talks about there, about connecting, etc. And then fundamentally, yeah, we belong. We feel we belong, you know. And then I think that's what interpretation's about a lot of the time. We're creating these experiences where people feel they belong to that particular message that we're looking to share. They have a part to play in that. They've got a journey and a relationship that's going to continue on beyond that experience. And I think that's a beautiful space to be in. We're really lucky as interpreters, I believe.
Absolutely. Well, and as interpreters, John, is the segue to my next question. I'm going to go from super broad, global scale interpretation down to as hyper local as you can get, and I'm going to go around the horn here. That's a baseball phrase, around the horn. So I hope it makes sense.
Of course, Paul, knowing you, mate. Of course.
I've just realized I used this phrase that probably has no context for you, but we're going to go around the horn, and I'm going to ask each of you, if you don't mind, to just describe how you got involved in the field of interpretation as individuals. You know, I find everyone's journey into this field to be really fascinating, and so I'd love to hear how that happened for you all. Sophie, we'll start with you if you don't mind.
So I guess I've always asked a lot of questions. I remember as a child always wanting to know why stuff was going on, why things were the way they were. And I was lucky enough to have a father who was a scientist who, you know, when I said, why is the sky blue? He didn't make something up. He literally started talking about, you know, light spectrums, etc., and why it's different at sunset and how that all works. So just that empowerment of that amazing knowledge paired with kind of still having that wonder about the world, I think was the starting point for me. So when I was at uni, I started working at Questacon, and I loved, you know, engaging with people and explaining these complex physics and mathematical and chemistry kind of, you know, processes, and just making it super fun and understandable for people. And so that was kind of the start of my journey.
So now you find yourself at the Botanic Gardens of Sydney. What is your role there? What does that job entail?
So at the Botanic Gardens of Sydney, I work with botanists and ecologists and First Nations traditional custodians of our beautiful spaces, and also with incredibly knowledgeable conservation horticulturalists. So there is all of this amazing knowledge and passion and commitment around me in this workplace. and these amazingly beautiful sites that I'm lucky enough to work on and with. And our living collections, of course, are the plants which, you know, create these beautiful spaces that people come and spend time in for lots of different reasons. So many of them come here for solace, many come just in their lunch break for, you know, to get away from the office. People come from all around the world to visit, especially. People come for school, for excursions, for spending time with family, all these different reasons, but they all end up here, and we have this opportunity to enhance that connection that they feel with the natural world, and to start to tell those stories of plants and people and place. And really, as John spoke earlier about how this is part of their journey, we hope to start them or help them continue on this journey of wanting to do something for the natural environment. So if there's anything they can do in their lives to help towards conserving these beautiful wild spaces that are threatened across Australia and around the world, then we just try to help them find those things that maybe they could do to make a difference, to be part of this kind of wave of action that we are at the forefront of with all our conservation work here at the Gardens. And so I love being part of it so very much.
Sophie, thank you so much. That's fantastic. I love it. Scott, how about you?
Yeah, I discovered interpretation quite by accident, actually. I had just finished my undergraduate degree. I got a double major in zoology and botany, and was looking for, trying to work out what to do next. And so I was offered a position in honours, and I wasn't quite sure I wanted to go into research. And so I looked for something to do and found there was a master's student who wanted some help radio tracking penguins. So we have a penguin colony down on Phillip Island. And so I signed up and went for a week down there, standing up on a tower with, you know, headphones on, radio tracking little penguins to find out their little location, movements and patterns. And then as a, you know, we were volunteering, and as a thank you, the rangers who were down there monitoring penguins every night up in towers with binoculars, we were invited to go up with them, which was terrific because it was nice and warm in there. It was freezing on the beach watching penguins. And so standing next to this ranger counting penguins coming up, we were just chatting, and they mentioned they had just done this course called interpretation. And I went, oh, what's that? And so we were chatting, and as I was describing the course that they had just done, it was a really lovely blend of this idea of education, but informal, this idea that was just trying to understand. And I was quite interested in education, but not so much formal as in terms of schools. And I thought this sounds perfect for me, blending my science background with the idea of really helping people understand the world in which they live. And so I had called, as soon as I got home, this was right at the end of the year, so all the university places had closed, and the postgraduate course probably took its last place about 2 months before that. So I called the lecturer that following morning, who was Rachel Faggoter at the time. And Rachel went, oh, well, we've already closed, but, you know, what are you interested in and why? And I told her, and she said, unusual. We, you know, most of our students are arts background sort of students. We don't get many science students. So are you really sure you want to do this? And I after that conversation, I got in a bit sort of like, I guess, a baseball term, if I could have the right baseball term, Paul, you know, sliding into home base.
There you go. I love it. Well done, Scott.
So that was it. So that was a year's postgraduate course. And at the same time, I was volunteering at the Museum Victoria in a sort of public engagement space. It was a really nice way of bringing things together. But as I said, quite by accident, quite by surprise. But here I am 30-something years later.
I have so many reactions to all this. I remember when I was in Australia in 2010, we traveled a little bit after the NAIA conference, and I made it down to Phillip Island and got to see they were calling them the fairy penguins at the time, and that has been changed to little penguins now.
The Australian little penguins now. Yep.
The Australian little penguins. That was amazing to see the smallest species of penguin, and they came scuttling out of the water as dusk hit, and then went to their burrows up there in the sand and the dunes, and that was super cool. And then you and I, when we first met, you were at the Melbourne Zoo.
That's right.
And now, what is Kelp Creative?
So Kelp Creative is a consultancy looking at all things interpretation, but really, you know, we use the word connect a lot, but I've rather used the term connectedness, and that idea of really helping people and broaden that sense and understanding that we're all part of something bigger. So whatever the opportunity that is, so I work with zoos, aquariums, museums, botanic gardens, councils, anyone and everyone that'll take me to really take and help craft those experiences. And for me, Cup Creative is all about, we've talked a little bit about this, but it's story-led but experience-driven. So yeah, stories really be part of it, but it's taking that next step further to what crafts a great, engaging experience that's based on a story and a site. But as you said, Zoos Victoria, I was at Museum Victoria. Once I finished postgraduate courses, I was at Museum Victoria for 10 years, Zoos Victoria for 15 years, and now Cup Creative, it's been, 6 years. So time flies.
Fantastic. I love it. John, how about you?
A little bit different in that I went to school in an era when teachers taught the way they taught and weren't adaptable or flexible. So if you had a bit of a learning challenge, learning mishap or difficulty, too bad, suck it up. And so it was a fairly abusive kind of environment for quite a number of years. And I used to escape, I used to run away. I had a mate who was, the school knew my mate's signature as my mum's, and they knew my signature as his mum. So we'd always write each other notes, and so, oh, John can't come to school today, or Trev can't come to school today. And so we disappear at different times. So I used to run down the Royal National Park. That was my solace, my place where I'd go and regroup, re-energise. And so in doing that, I bumped into a ranger. Obviously, there's a classic story. And the ranger went, oh, hello. I went, hello. And he went, it's school day. And I went, yeah, it is school day. And he goes, well, what are you doing out here? And I went, well, I'm on a field excursion. And he looked around and went, and the other students are? I went, well, it's a very progressive school, mate. We do very individual-based work. And he went, oh, really? Really? Okay, well, listen, given that fact, how about we go for a little walk? And so for an hour, he took me out and he showed me, he got me tasting Banksia cones and he got me doing this and got me doing that. And it was just insane. So there's a few layers to that. One is that he saw me as a young kid, beyond the role, beyond the identity, beyond this kid in school. He saw me as a kid. He saw me as a human being. That was gorgeous, And also from that day on, I didn't just see the bush as this green area. Suddenly there was layers to it. And I think that was the beauty of what he did from an interpretive perspective, is he gave me a sense of, Scott talks about connectiveness and connection, etc. He gave me a sense of depth and dimension to that environment that I didn't have before. And that was the interpretive journey for me that hooked me in. And then from that moment on, he ended up becoming my senior ranger when I first started work in the National Parks and Wildlife Service. 10 years later, he's my first supervisor.
That's amazing. And so when you say what you were talking about what you do now, that is story comms, yes? So what is story comms?
That's really much the main the main focus area in there is what I call into nature, into self. So I facilitate nature-based experiences in which people get to enrich their own self and their connections to their own self, and through that then connections to other people and the wider world.
I knew I would. I love all of these stories, these journeys that we're all on in this amazing profession. So collectively, you all are involved with Interpretation Australia. One of the things I know that we all have to do with our professional associations is keep our fingers on the pulse of trends in interpretation in our respective countries. Are there any trends in interpretation that you see in Australia right now, last, I don't know, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? What are we seeing in Australia that we might not be seeing in other places around the world?
If I could just pick up on what Scott mentioned, I think a big trend for us was that narrowing of where interpretation was recognised. It had very strong identity in that built heritage space, and we started to lose it in some of the other areas. And I think, how do you call that a trend? I guess it's a trend in terms of how it drifted towards a particular niche within that interpretive world. And exactly what Scott said, it dominated there for a while. And now what we're looking to do is go, hey, look, it's relevant in these other areas as well. So as a trend for us, that upkick to look to broaden its application would be something that we're focusing on. It's like Scott and Sophie said, we all do it in our own way individually. It's that sense of community, that wider interpretive community, and having that represented as well.
Another trend here, locally anyway, is the desire to really work with First Nations groups to help convey and tell their stories. And I see that more and more. I mean, to some extent, it's becoming a requirement, and that's creates its own challenges where we have a lot of First Nations groups who are quite resource limited, and so there's lots of demand, and so that creates a challenge in itself. But that aside, there is a genuine sense, I feel, and certainly what I've seen and I've been part of, is to really work with those groups to help tell not to tell their stories. And there's an interesting Interpretation Australia a number of years ago looked at doing some guidelines around sort of interpreting First Nations cultures. And back then there was a sense that, you shouldn't share those stories unless they're your culture. And I'm not sure if we were to do that work again, I think we should. I'm not sure the guidelines would be specifically the same. Most definitely those people should be the ones to tell those stories, but I see our roles in really helping facilitate that process. And I think that's a much stronger trend now than it was even a few years ago, probably even with, 5 years ago, that sense of seeing its importance, but also seeing our role in helping to facilitate the process, our role as in non-Aboriginal people. The challenge with that comes, I think, and one of the reasons I think it's a trend that's developing is a lot more people are looking to do that, but a lot of people are saying, well, how do I do that? And one of the challenges of that is that that's so different depending on the group you're working with and the organisation you work with and all those sorts of things. But I certainly think that's a growing trend. I'm sure Sophie and John would add to that as well.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that, Scott, because that is something that keeps coming up a lot, and that is that I believe, and I think this is what Scott's saying as well, we have got a responsibility to share a perspective of the First Nation story. And I mentioned that if you can imagine two circles and you've got story of place, and in that story of place, there's stories, the First Nation story in there, but there's also our story. We're connected to place. I know as a kid, I've been connected to natural environment since a kid. I've got my stories, yeah. Then there's that, so that's that second circle is my connection to place, my connection story. So you've got this First Nations connection to a place, then you've got my connection to place. Where they overlap, I believe we've got a responsibility to share that, because otherwise I am missing the element of connection to place. If I overlap with a First Nations person and we've got a similar story, well, this is my story and my connection, and that's your story and your connection. Hey, how awesome is that? How powerful is this place that we can get two perspectives from that whitefella perspective and First Nations perspective? Isn't that rich? And so there's that element about finding those connections that we have that mean something to us that overlap with First Nations. So there's a space. There's other First Nation story. Obviously, we don't share. We don't have a right to do that. Nor we just shouldn't do that. And there's another element to that is that if I entertain and I share a perspective on First Nation story, that in my interpretive experience, I've got an opportunity to then promote that. So like say, for example, I'm there and I'm out in the scrub and I'm talking about stuff, we go past an engraving site and I can share a generic connection to place and then a generic perspective on that. And at the end of that experience, I go, listen, that really special engraving site we went past, I'll tell you what, like there's a guy that runs, the First Nations guy that runs activities here once a week. I'd recommend you go on his tour. So that I've given a teaser, if you like. I've provided my connection, my perspective on that, and was able to promote and further the actual First Nations experiences as well. I think that discussion piece, I think it's a tough one, and I think we need to be in there. And I think the trend, I like what Scotty was just saying, and that I think that's a conversation that we're having, and I think it's a really important conversation to have.
Yeah, so I think this is such an important and beautiful part of the interpretation journey in Australia and our community's journey, that for a while there was a silence, because even if people did want to tell those stories, they didn't understand how, or they didn't feel like they could make that connection. And now I think more and more there's an understanding that it's about a collaboration and it's about empowering those First Nations communities to tell their stories in their own way and to choose what is shared and how it's shared. And so that's something which I think is evolving, and there's a lot of kind of legal framework around all of that too, which I think is helping to protect the knowledge and the owners of that cultural knowledge. And so it's not taken from them, it's not reused in different ways that they haven't approved of and been part of. And that's something which I think is ongoing. And I guess it's an interesting thing that links in with that idea about heritage interpretation, because I guess with First Nations cultures, it's also about the fact that that's a living and rich culture. So although yes, it's part of a heritage, it's also part of our story today and into the future together. And that culture is evolving and is alive, and is something that we celebrate. So we have a responsibility to do so, but also I think it's a joy and a privilege for us to be able to be part of that.
In my work with First Nations mob, I just had this conversation with the Gamilaroi man the other day, a good mate of mine, and what we got to, like, it's that really important point, exactly what Sophie said about story, because like from a First Nations perspective, their culture is a living culture, and a lot of that is through story. And so stories need to be shared, they need to be respected, and who has the right to tell, etc. If we don't do that, then stories pass away, and if they pass away, then so does the identity piece, so does that whole connection piece, so does that whole understanding piece. And I think it's so important. Again, like exactly what Scotty and then Sophie started sharing about First Nations is it's an interesting, it's a challenging, it's an exciting space.
We keep dovetailing into my next question, but my last question for you all is, and I realize we're probably going a little longer than we usually do on this podcast, but I think this is such an important conversation, and I'm so grateful to you all for making time, at first thing in the morning for me, like I said. But Interpretation Australia, organizationally, are there new initiatives? I know organizationally you've been through some changes recently. Are there new initiatives, new goals? What's new with Interpretation Australia?
So a couple of years ago now, there was a new strategic plan that was put in place for Interpretation Australia, and Scott was a big part of that. And I guess that's now guiding us, and it's super exciting because I do feel like we're having a bit of a renaissance in a way. We're launching new member activities, so podcasts, community cuppa, where we can exchange ideas. The website's having a bit of a revamp. We're starting to look ahead now to our next conference and thinking about that. So I do feel like there's an energy and a kind of momentum that's building with us, but it's all guided and grounded in that strategic plan that was put together.
And so the biggest shift around that refocus was also a reminder for the organization that it is a national organization. And in the past, a lot of emphasis had been on small local networks which was a really important part of Interpretation Australia, getting local networks together and building that sort of collaboration. And I think with a lot of organizations really suffered during COVID, and sort of that a lot of those networks broke down, with a lot of people then locating and working from home, that sort of stretched those. A lot of people sort of lost contact with one another. And now we've sort of come out of the other side saying, okay, it's time now to really reinvigorate that, as Sophie said. So looking at to run a whole lot more sort of engagement, but with a much more deliberate focus on both an online and a face-to-face capacity, which is stuff we know NAI has been doing well for such a long time, and we've certainly been learning from that. We're really looking for how do we ensure that those activities and those professional development opportunities that we offer are available to anyone, regardless of where you are, and that real reminder that you're part of a national network. So I think it's probably really stepping that up, and to say, okay, let's run a schedule of activities. And for the first time, we've been able to engage and employ a part-time role to really drive those initiatives, because we've been, Sophie, John, and I, it's an organisation that survived on the goodwill of volunteers for over 30 years now. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary recently, but we're getting to the point, say, for the strategy to do what it needs to do, and to really broaden that network that we're talking about, to engage all of those people that are the unknown interpreters, unknown largely to themselves, to really engage them and to really ramp up that engagement across Australia. Then we really need to invest in a part-time role, which we have done. And Jennifer Waithman's a long-time friend of NAI's, and so Jen's doing a terrific role in really helping to engage interpreters right across Australia.
I did say that was my last question, but I have to say that after John and I met in, I guess it was 2009 that we met, the year before the 2010 conference, John and Jonathan Spring from New Zealand, we started a little text thread, or I guess it wasn't a text thread, it was an email thread back then. where we would share, some notes about the sports teams, our favorite sports teams in our respective countries. And I went to a St. Kilda Saints Aussie Rules footy match, which, I was happy to report back on. But John, I guess my last question for you is, how about my Philadelphia Eagles, the Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles?
How awesome, Paul. Awesome, mate. The best part of that win, the absolute pinnacle of that win, was seeing that photo of you at your place with all your mates celebrating the Eagles win. It was just gorgeous. I tried to make that as viral as I could here in Australia. I really did. And I left it as, hey, here's a mate who's celebrating his footy team's win. So I was careful with my language, because if I said American football, they might switch off. But football, they can kind of engage with it straight away and go, yeah, man, sporting is so important. Look at this guy celebrating his win.
I did send that picture during the Super Bowl, didn't I?
That was a gorgeous picture, mate. Yeah. How you manage to balance on one tippy toe on a moving table while holding a drink and your photo and your phone is amazing.
And the Eagles flag. Well, Sophie and Scott and John, thank you again so much. This has really been an absolute pleasure. Sophie, I'll just ask you, where can folks find Interpretation Australia online if they're interested in learning more about what you're doing? Where can people find you, maybe on social media and whatnot?
So we're on LinkedIn, and then also if people want to jump on our website, which is interpretationaustralia.asn.au.
Okay, that is super easy.
And interpreters,
That's what's up.
What's up?